In this section, we're going to dive into the crucial Angular essentials, the core concepts every Angular developer must know, and we'll do so by building a complete demo application from the ground up. And whilst building this demo application and all the features it offers, you will learn about the Angular project structure, so how Angular projects are structured and what the different files and folders in there do. You will learn about this important concept of working with components, which I already mentioned in the first course section. And of course, you will also learn about those other core concepts like TypeScript or writing declarative code. You will specifically also learn how to handle user events like clicks, so how you can react to those. And you will also learn how to write Angular code that gets Angular to render and update a dynamic user interface, so that by the end of the section, you're able to build dynamic web applications like the demo app we're building in this section on your own. So to dive into all those crucial essentials and build this demo project, I prepared a new starting project, and you find a link to it attached, and I do recommend that you use it so that we all have the same starting state. And it is a project that has been created with the Angular CLI. And as you can tell, such a project then comes with a bunch of configuration files and also an SRC folder, which then contains more files and folders inside of it. Now, one thing you might see if you create a new project with the CLI, depending on the CLI version you're using, is that such newly created projects come with a public folder, which contains a favicon file, which in the attached project doesn't exist. There, the favicon file is stored in the SRC folder. Now, small differences like this exist because different CLI versions create different starting projects. Of course, the Angular code you write is the same. It's just small differences like where you might want to store image assets like that favicon. That's why I provide that starting project, so that we do all have the same starting state. Of course, as I just said, the code we write will always be the same, no matter which exact project structure you might have. And now to get started, I quickly want to walk you through the files and folders we have here, because it is of course important to understand why we have all those files and what they're doing. Now, the files you find in the root level, so in the top level of your project, are essentially all configuration files. We got some configuration files for TypeScript, and you shouldn't change them unless you know what you're doing. The defaults should be fine here, because these files simply control how exactly the TypeScript code will be compiled to JavaScript code under the hood. The compilation will be triggered automatically by the Angular CLI, so you don't have to do that manually, but these files control how that works and also how strict TypeScript is, how quickly it complains about potential errors, and so on. Then we have these package files here, which in the end manage the dependencies of your application. And here you mostly find all those Angular packages, which of course are dependencies because we will use features from these packages in our code. Then we got this angular.json file, which contains extra configuration settings for the Angular CLI and Angular provided tools in general. And just as with the TypeScript configuration, you typically don't need to change anything here in this Angular JSON file unless you know what you're doing, and we'll take a closer look at this configuration file a little bit later in the course. And then we also have these two configuration files here, where the editor config contains some rules for the code editor regarding how the code should be formatted, and so on. And the gitignore file is relevant if you're using Git for version control. And then we have this SRC folder, which is the important folder in this project, because it's in this folder, or specifically actually in the app folder in this src folder where you will spend most of your time, because it's here where you will build your Angular components and write your Angular code. Now in this src folder, you find a bunch of files right inside of it, like the styles CSS file, which sets up some global styles that will apply to the entire web application across all components. You find an index.html file, which is the main HTML file that will be loaded when visitors visit your website, and we'll get back to this file and why it's important in just a second. We got a favicon, and then this main.ts file, which is a .ts file because it's actually containing TypeScript code, and it's an important file because it will be the first code file, so to say, to be executed when your Angular application loads up in the browsers of your visitors. So the code in this file will be the first code to be executed, and we'll also get back to that in a second. And then we got the assets folder where you could store images that should be used, like this logo, which I'm actually already using in that starting project I provided to you, and the app folder in which you will spend most of your time because it's in this folder where you will build and combine all those Angular components. Now, as you might have seen, I'm getting some error here in the main.ts file, and that's happening because at this point I actually haven't installed all those dependencies that are mentioned in the package.json file yet, and therefore to do that, what you should do after downloading that starting code snapshot is open your default command prompt or terminal and navigate into this folder, and then run npm install in there. This will install all those dependencies, and you only need to do this once, not every time you start working on the project again, only once, so that you have all those dependencies. And you can ignore any warnings you might be getting there. As long as it finished without an error, you're good to go. And good to go then means that as a next step, you can start that development server that allows you to preview the application on which you're working in the browser. And you can do that by simply running npm start in this project, because under the hood, this will actually execute ngserve. So it will use the Angular CLI under the hood, and it will then spin up that development server, which allows you to preview the website under that address that's being output here. And when you then visit this address here, you should see this site on your screen. And in the next lecture, we'll now explore how exactly this content ends up on our screen. So how does this content end up on our screen? Well, I mentioned in the previous lecture that it would be that index.html file in the src folder that would in the end be loaded by the browser when visitors visit our website. But if you take a closer look at that file, you will see that it's almost empty. The body element there only contains one HTML element, this strange app root element here, which is not a standard HTML element. The browser on its own indeed would not understand this element. And that's now where Angular comes in. Because as I mentioned, it's actually the code in this main.ts file that will be executed when your website loads up. Now in the index.html file, you don't find any imports of that main.ts file. Indeed, there are no script tags at all in there. But if you visit the loaded website and you view its page source, you will actually see that in there are script imports. And those are injected into this file automatically by the Angular CLI when you build and run your application. So for example, by running ngserve, which we did by running npm start. So that's how the scripts end up in there, and that's how this code in main.ts gets executed, after being compiled to JavaScript code, which is also done by the CLI. That's why in that source code we actually find .js files being imported here, because TypeScript wouldn't run in the browser. So it's this compiled code that's being executed. And this code does one important thing. It executes a function provided by the Angular package, the Bootstrap application function, and this function in the end wants an Angular component. And as I mentioned in the first section, one of the core concepts of Angular is that you will be building components. So this function wants such a component, And it in the end then takes this component and looks for this component in that index.html file and tries to replace the tag, the element tag of your custom component, with the markup you defined for your custom component. Now here in this case, it's actually this app component imported from this path here that's being passed to Bootstrap application. And if we follow that path, we end up in this app folder, and there the app component.ts file. Now the file extension is actually missing here because for .ts files you should omit them. So instead of importing something from a .ts file, you import it from just the file name without the extension. But it is this app.component.ts file from which we're importing something, and we are importing something called app component. And if we take a look at this app.component.ts file, we see that this is this class. This class is called app component. So it's that thing we're importing and passing to this Bootstrap application function here. And this class in Angular creates such a component, such a custom HTML element. Now it does that because it's not just a class here. Instead, we also have this strange add component thing above it. And that's a so-called decorator, which is a TypeScript feature that in the end adds some metadata to that thing it's attached to, so to this class here. And Angular uses decorators like this component decorator to add extra metadata to certain things, like to this class here. And as you can see, this component decorator is actually coming from the Angular framework. We're importing it from the core package that's part of the Angular framework. And it's then this decorator that converts this standard class into such an Angular component that's treated as a component. So as a custom HTML element by Angular, you could say. Now this component thing here, this component decorator, then receives an object with some configuration for this component. And I'll get back to some of these options later, but one crucial setting you can see here is this selector property. Because this in the end tells Angular for which elements it should look in the HTML code so that those elements can be replaced by this component and its markup. And the markup of this component is stored in the so-called template of that component, and every Angular component has such a template, which typically is stored in an external file to which the path is provided with help of this template URL property. So here it's this app component HTML file that contains the markup for this component, for this custom HTML element. So now because of this selector, we know that we're looking for an element called app-root, so with a tag of app-root, and that it's this markup that should be rendered in its place. We also have some styles set up, also stored in an external file, and these will be styles that only apply to the markup of this component, so they can't clash with any other styles of other components, which is pretty convenient. And we got some other settings which we can ignore for now. But it's because of this setup and because of this selector here, most importantly, that this app-root element in the index.html file is replaced by the markup stored in this app component HTML file. And that is this title, this subtitle, and this image here. And that indeed is what we're seeing on the screen. And that's how Angular is taking over and how such an Angular component ends up on the screen.